Thank you very much, especially you, Tarika. It's remarkable to see what remarkable students are here at Hendrix today and pursuing the kinds of projects that you are, so I commend you. And thank you for having me back. As I was sitting there, I was thinking how 9 months ago, almost exactly, I was sitting at the base of the podium that President Obama, President Obama was taking the oath of office, and I turned and looked back across the million people, however many it was, who were out across the National Mall. I described it in the Journal, the Wall Street Journal, where I worked the next day, as something like an undulating, glittering sea of human optimism. And I'm struck, and was struck then, by what a remarkable time we are blessed to live in America. Not just because we've elected a black president, but because we've reached a time in the history of our country and in the intellectual evolution of our society that we're able to write about and think about and talk about things that I think even just a few years ago would have been extraordinarily difficult to do. It's a time in which a guy like me can write an incredibly grim book about terrible things that happened in the past, and it actually find an audience and actually win a Pulitzer Prize. As I was sitting there, I was also struck by how remarkable it is that we live in a time that a guy like me, who so terrorized the administration of Hendrix College some years ago, can come back today and receive this honor. But I'm often asked, or I have often been asked over the past year when I'm talking about my book, a question that I'm asked it so often, in fact, that I now answer it before the question is asked it's being formulated in the crowd. But the question usually goes something along the lines of, why would a white guy from the Mississippi Delta who works for Rupert Murdoch at the most conservative newspaper in America write a book like the one that I wrote, which for those few of you who have not yet completed it, is the story of how slavery was resurrected after the Civil War, after its legal abolition, and how the forced labor of thousands of African Americans was reinstituted in the South and persisted deep into the 20th century, and the parties and the companies and the institutions which profited from that practice and the ways in which it sculpted the society that we live in today. But my answer to that question when I'm asked it is long-winded, as most of my answers are. But a part of the answer is here and is with some of those who are sitting in front of me here, Dr. Larson and Hindenburg and King and Chappell and others who I think perhaps are not here, Ken Story and Bland Crowder and many others. But Hendrix was for me a place where I learned to, I hope, constructively channel my compulsion to ask the question, why are things the way they are? How did we arrive in the place that we are in? Why are things as screwed up as they sometimes are, and certainly as they were in the Mississippi Delta of my childhood in many ways? And it was here at Hendrix that I learned so much about the kind of critical thinking that equipped me to write a book that ultimately challenged such basic assumptions about American history as the idea that slavery ended with the end of the Civil War. One of the things I always like to say and try to remind people about the book, which is a work of history and not a polemical, but it is not a history of black Americans, and it is also, though it's often shelved in black history, unfortunately, it's also not a story of the terrible things that white Americans did. It's not an argument for whites in America to walk around humped over with guilt. It's also not an argument necessarily for reparations or some of the other conversations that we have about race in America. But instead, it's the story of things that Americans did to Americans. It's American history, and it's a history that I think if ever we are to forge a shared vision for our society, the kind of shared vision that as Americans I believe we all intend and say we seek to have, certainly in a remarkable time like the one we live in now, it's a terrible history that we have to be honest about and confront and grapple with in a way that we can then forge that shared vision. So I thank Hendrix for helping me to find my way to contributing to that conversation, and I thank you for having me back today.